Welcome to part 2 of The Leader's Secret to Influencing Without Alienating. We are working on you feeling unruffled when you need to deal with an awkward situation and actually changing the texture of those previously tricky conversations. In part 1 of the program, we looked at communications that are direct versus indirect, the vertical continuum, and hostile versus responsive, the horizontal continuum. And in so doing, we distinguish between 4 behaviors: aggressive, which sits in the hostile direct quadrant; defensive, which sits in the hostile indirect quadrant; submissive, which sits in the responsive indirect quadrant; and assertive, which sits in the responsive direct quadrant. In part 1, I mentioned that I was going to ask you some questions in part 2. Well, here goes. My first question for you is this: where do you tend to sit on the assertion matrix? Of course, your behavior will move around a bit. You'll be different when you're chilled to when you are when you're stressed. But think about your natural tendencies. What would those who are closest to you say about where you tend to sit? What about your friends who know you well? Just to get a bit more granular about this, consider each quadrant is divided into 4, a quadrant within a quadrant. Where might you sit within a quadrant? For example, in the aggression corner of the assertion quadrant. If that's the case when you're feeling cornered, excuse the pun, you'll tend to be more aggressive. Now here's the cruncher. Your position on the assertion matrix is an indication of where you can increase your influence. Before we look at how you might respond assertively in certain situations, let's do a quick check on typical reactions to the 4 behaviors. How do you feel when a person is behaving submissively with you? Imagine you're at the other end of circuitous, hiding, manipulative, yielding behaviors. How do you react? Typically, we feel frustrated and impatient and distrusting, unsure where the other person is coming from, and disrespectful of such accommodating behavior, and confused about what the other person really wants. It's not hard to guess at how much influence a person with submissive behavior has, is it? Yep, they have low influence. Let's think about defensive behavior. What are the likely consequences for a person who's behaving defensively? What are the likely consequences of their internal, emotionally withdrawn, stubborn, and covertly hostile behaviors? Here's how others have responded to that question. People will avoid interacting with them. They'll have little connection with others. Their relationships will be distant, therefore trust will be low. And importantly, a person behaving defensively definitely won't be very influential with others. It's time to look at aggressive behavior. How influential are you likely to be if you behave aggressively? That is, if you're displaying the 4 facets of aggression, which are blunt, dogmatic, abusive, win-lose oriented. Well, the thing is, short-term compliance is possible because if you're bullying, but at the end of the day, how much rapport, trust and respect do we generate when we're aggressive? And rapport, trust and respect are necessary for you to influence. We're going to look at a couple of potential real-life scenarios now and put together an assertive response. Here's the first one. An associate at work asks you for a ride home. It's inconvenient because you're late and the drive will take you out of your way. You say, develop an assertive response to this scenario, that is, a response which is direct, solution-oriented, win-win, and persistent, although persistence can't really be demonstrated without a longer interaction. Here's my textbook response. I'm happy to help. I'm running rather late, so rather than take you all of the way home, are you okay if I take you part way to a bus stop, which is convenient for you? Notice how a win-win result was targeted, and the response ended with a question to see if the proposed solution would work for the other person. How does your response work in terms of it being direct, solution-oriented, win-win, and ready to be persistent? We'll develop an assertive response to one more potential real-life scenario. Here it is. Another function in your organization frequently fails to meet the time commitments it makes. You've decided to assertively address the situation with the individual concerned. You say, here's my response. I'm feeling frustrated because my expectations about the timing of the XYZ reports is often not met. Can we talk about what we could do to align our expectations with their timing? Notice I own the problem rather than point the finger at them. And I disclosed my feelings and avoided having an emotional outburst. How is your response? Check it in terms of it being direct, solution-oriented, win-win, and ready to be persistent. We have one last scenario to look at, and it's an interpersonal situation that's real in your life. I want you to choose a current interpersonal situation in which you want to be influential. You could be avoiding dealing with the issue at the moment, or you might have tried to have a conversation which didn't go well. What real-life situation will you choose? It's important that before you launch into your conversation, you do some planning by answering these questions. What's your intent for the conversation you're about to have? How do you feel about the situation as it currently stands and about having the conversation? What's a possible win for the other person? Take a minute to note your answers to these 3 questions. Now it's time for you to write your possible script for this scenario, just in case you're ready to have the conversation. Let me help you. What would be a direct and honest opening? Maybe when, blah, 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 I felt, blah, blah, blah. What would have you focused on a solution? What about what we could do is blah, blah. Check that your solution will work for the other party. How do you feel about that? How could you be persistent if necessary? I feel strongly about this and I want to be sure we get it resolved. What can we do to make sure it won't start happening again? You'll need to stop the video to write your script. How's your script looking when you measure it against the Leaders Influencing Without Alienating checklist in your guidebook? Take a look at it now and see how your script measures up. Having planned your interaction, you have 2 options. If you want to practice, you could practice your interaction with a friendly pretend other person before going live, or you could jump straight in and carry out your interaction. Once you've had the conversation, I suggest that you use the Leaders Influencing Without Alienating checklist and consider what you did well and where you have opportunities to enhance your assertive behavior. You've done really well. There was a lot of content to get us to this point. In this second video, we've looked at where you were sitting on the assertion matrix, how you feel when someone's behaving submissively with you, what are the likely consequences for a person who's behaving defensively, how influential a person is when they're being aggressive, and what would be an assertive response to a couple of potential scenarios. And then you prepared to carry out your real-life scenario. Use the Leaders Influencing Without Alienating checklist to validate your script. And then you use that checklist to consider what you did well and where you could have opportunities to enhance your assertive behavior. Where to from here? The Deal with Your Roadblocks program is guaranteed to help you become the leader you've dreamed of becoming and realize your career goals. Bearing that in mind, here's what I recommend as your next step, which won't cost you a cent. I recommend you apply for a roadblocks assessment session. A roadblocks assessment session is a one-on-one phone or Skype interaction with me that will enable you to figure out exactly what's currently between you and the leader you've dreamed of becoming. In our conversation, we'll figure out what's currently keeping you stuck and learn about how you can turn that around. Once we've looked at your personal situation, if you're interested, I'll give you my recommendation about the type of Deal with Your Roadblocks program that would best suit you.